Tired of the congressional gridlock, which is one byproduct of gerrymandering, Tennessee Representative Democrat Steve Cohen of Memphis introduced a bill this week which would require states to use independent redistricting commissions in drawing those maps. Joining me now to talk about his bill and what he expects during President Obama's second term is Congressman Steve Cohen. He joins me from Washington. Congressman, welcome into the War Room.
Thank you, Michael. Good to be with you.
Well, we're glad to have you. You know, what makes you think at this time that Congress will or could or might pass this bill?
Well, whether they will or could is doubtful, but it's an important bill because I think we do have gridlock. There's no question. And part of the reason for that is too many districts are determined by the primaries, and the people are only concerned about the far right or the far left or whatever, and they don't have to work with the whole community or the center. And that's because the partisan redistricting, which we've had and have in most states, draw these districts up just to suit their people and make them to their overwhelmingly Republican. You showed that map. Ohio went for the president. Ohio went for Sherrod Brown for the United States Senate. And yet 12 of the 16 districts that were drawn by the red Ohio legislature went Republican. Well, that's not right. It doesn't really reflect the will of the people. It reflects these lines that they draw. It makes it to where, and those Republicans don't have to work toward the center or work with President Obama at all. And the agenda which he set out, which is an encouraging agenda concerning climate change, concerning opportunity for people, and women having fair pay, and gays having civil rights, and other issues that he brought up the other day aren't issues that have any home in the Republican primary. So those people elected in those districts don't have to even think about it. California's got such a law. It's drawn by an independent commission. Unfortunately, it cost us Howard Berman, who was put in a district with Brad Sherman. But those are the kind of things that happen. But I think overall, the districts are more independent, and California will get better representation, and the country will get better representation. I put the bill in hope, thinking there is gridlock in Washington. One of the reasons is because of the redistricting and how these districts are so tilted, and another is because of lack of public financing and too many people being concerned about PAC contributions or independent expenditures by the wealthy, and that's another issue we need to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, they seem to go hand in hand to a degree, but isn't this kind of like the issue that filibuster reform is in the Senate, that, you know, it's always going to work to the congressman's best interest to keep their district the way it is. So the idea, you know, that we say all the time, listen, you were a state senator, you know that all this stuff happens at the state level, and that's why these elections on the state level are so important to fight the Republicans being able to control these legislatures like that. I mean, it just seems that that's so obvious. But don't you see those two, don't you see a parallel?
Well, there is a parallel. 2010 was a perfect storm, and the Republicans came in and they took a lot of these legislatures, then drew the lines. The lines will affect us for the next 10 years. The Congress isn't going to like this bill or be for it, but I think you have to, when you're the minority, you introduce ideas, and you have to try to keep a focus on what can make the system better and maybe show up their weak points with such a bill, because they're probably not going to consider it because they do control it. In fact, what they're doing now in Ohio and some states that are states that voted blue for president but are red-controlled legislatures is they're looking at changing the way they distribute their electoral vote for the election 4 years from now, and they can do that. And I think Maine does it, maybe one other state like Nebraska. They apportion their representation based on the vote, and so instead of the Democrats getting all of Ohio, which they did this time, or all of Pennsylvania, they would only get like 60% of the electoral votes. So they're looking at different ways to find ways to get the presidency by changing the game. The game shouldn't be changed by politicians. The game should be fair. And
if you don't like the results, change the rules. I mean, that's what they're basically saying. Let's shift gears a little bit to some of the issues of the day, especially since yesterday was the inauguration. Today, though, the 40th anniversary of the death of President Johnson. LBJ fought for the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Here is what he had to say about its importance. This is the day he signed the act into law.
Today is a triumph for freedom as huge as any victory that's ever been won on any battlefield.
And even as he spoke then, you know, that long ago, the Supreme Court has agreed to hear a constitutional challenge to the act this year. In President Obama's inaugural address yesterday, though, he recognized that the battle for voting rights isn't over. Here's the president.
Our journey is not complete until no citizen is forced to wait for hours to exercise the right to vote.
You know, now that the president has won re-election, he's been re-inaugurated, do you think that voters' access to the ballot is at risk still?
I do think it is, because the Republicans are a minority party. They got a minority in the presidential and the Senate, and also in the overall House races. And they're not working with the demographic groups that are growing in this country, which is particularly Latino. They cannot come together on issues concerning immigration or other issues that are important to Latinos, and that's going to make it impossible for them to break into that voting bloc. So the only way they can win is changing the rules. And I know that I could maybe cite some great political philosophers, but I'd cite Gary Trudeau in Doonesbury recently, where he has been featuring this type of politic, to where we'll just change the rules and make it more difficult for people to vote to win the election. And it's that simple, and you can see it in Doonesbury. That's what they're doing, and that's the way they've won in the past, and that's the way they're trying. They tried to win this year by all those photo ID laws. There was no need for photo ID. That was a way to try to diminish the vote of young people and diminish the vote of African Americans and other minorities. What it did was so enrage the African American community and others that they got out and voted and said, we're not going to take this, and we're coming out, and it enraged them, and the vote was good. They're going to keep doing this because it's the only way they can win. They are not a majority party in this country, and they can only win through skullduggery.
And they're going to keep doing it, and the problem will be if that rage continues. They have to keep the rage against this going. I want to turn your attention to another issue that the House is going to be facing, one which, you know, as a minority member of the House, you're probably pessimistic about. But there, you know, today there was another shooting, another day, another shooting. This time it was a community college in Houston. 3 people were wounded. Do you think, Congressman, that meaningful gun safety legislation has a chance of passing through the House that you sit in right now?
I really don't, and I hate to say that, but I've said it before. It's just the NRA is in the DNA of the GOP, and they're not going to let it out. They might have a hearing. I don't think they'll even let a bill come up. Now, the Senate could pass something and put it on another bill, and we deal with it, but I don't know if it'll get scheduled for a vote. They like the NRA, and the NRA likes to sell guns, and they like to sell high-capacity magazines. And I'm not against the NRA per se. I'm not against the Second Amendment, but I am against the high-capacity magazines and the assault rifles, and I think there are reasonable restrictions on Second Amendment that we can have in this country and should have to protect the public, and certainly background checks and the loophole at the gun shows needs to be stopped, but I don't think the Republicans will let it happen.
Yeah, it's really depressing. It's depressing when you see the news, when you hear about all this gunfire, and these Republicans just will not move because they're in the hands of the NRA. It's really pathetic. They're a bunch of clowns sometimes. But we are a better country because we have people like you in the House of Representatives. Thank you, Representative Steve Cohen, Democrat of Tennessee.
Good to be in the war room. Thank you, Michael.
Now it is time, though, to pause and to look at the latest loss of life to gun violence.